past summer, Anna and Alex Geller, who live in Nahariya in northern Israel, took their 4-year-old son Ariel to visit the Hecht Archaeological Museum in Haifa. And the Hecht Museum has a unique philosophy. They believe that their artifacts should not be displayed behind glass cases because they want their visitors to have direct access without any barriers to history. And so, because it was not behind glass, 4-year-old Ariel Geller decided that he was going to peek inside a 3,500-year-old Bronze Age jar. And of course, there was a crash. And Ariel's father, who had just turned his back, really just for a moment, he heard that crash and he thought to himself, please, God, don't let that be my child. But, of course, it was his child. And Alex turned around to see his 4-year-old son standing amidst the broken shards of an exceedingly rare, intact Bronze Age jar. A jar that predated the reigns of King David and King Solomon. It was made 1,000 years before the destruction of the first temple, and now it was in pieces on the ground. The situation could have very easily gone awry for the Geller family, but thank God it didn't. The museum understood exactly what had happened very quickly. They knew that the jar was knocked over not due to vandalism, but simply due to the curiosity of a young boy. In fact, the museum director's primary concern was not for the jar, but actually for the child and his family. She didn't want them to feel ashamed or afraid to either visit her museum or any museum in the future because of what Ariel had done. So, a week after the incident, Inbal Rivlin, the director of the Hecht Archaeological Museum in Haifa, invited the entire Geller family back to the museum for a private tour and to see the progress that was being made on the restoration of that jar. And the jar was indeed successfully restored. It's now back on display in Haifa, but as a deliberate choice on the part of the museum, a small piece of that jar remains missing. Because everything that happens to an object is part of its story, even, or maybe especially, the missing parts. And of course, that story of the jar in Haifa speaks to something much deeper. It beautifully captures what has happened to the Jewish people over the course of this past year. Exactly 1 year ago, this morning on the Hebrew calendar, on Shmini Atzeret, I stood here, right here on this spot, as we were just beginning to hear preliminary reports about what was happening in Israel on October 7th. And on that day, exactly a year ago on the Hebrew calendar, just like that jar, we were shattered. Our hope was shattered. Our faith was shattered. Our belief that Israel would always be a safe haven for the Jewish people was shattered. And yet, here we are, a year later. The war continues to be waged and 101 hostages remain in captivity, but Hassan Nasrallah, the longtime leader of Hezbollah, is gone. Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas and the architect of October 7th, is gone. It finally feels like we're beginning to heal. Finally, we're beginning to put our broken shards back together. But just like that restored jar, a piece of us is missing. Because after the event of this past year, a piece of our collective Jewish heart will always be missing. And so too it is when we lose a loved one, when we lose a parent, a sibling, a spouse, God forbid, a child. We too are shattered. That's why we perform the ritual act of kriyah, the tearing of our garments, when we hear of the death of a loved one, because we are tearing our clothing to reflect our shattered hearts. But over time, slowly but surely, over weeks or months, or in some cases even years, our hearts are restored. The shattered pieces are put back together, but we know they will never be fully restored. There will always be that piece missing. Because, to paraphrase the director of that museum in Haifa, everything that happens to an object or to a human being is part of its story, even, or maybe especially, the missing parts. Our God and God of our ancestors, our grief lingers. Part of us is afraid to let go. afraid that we will forget. Give us the strength and the wisdom to share the stories of our loved ones with wonder and with joy. Let us pay tribute to their days and their years, and may the memories of those who are no longer here always endure as a blessing within our midst. We rise on page 330 for the beginning of the Yizkor service.